Because America is able to print as much US dollars as it wants to fund its corruption, it does so, okay? So the US dollar has...
Professor Jiang just exposed how corrupt the US really is and how the petrodollar is collapsing. After everything that's been going on lately, I might have to agree with him. Watch these clips to understand what's really happening.
Major innovation in science itself, right? And the third thing, the university of the US dollar leads to printing dollars, okay? Or just basically corruption. Where because America is able to print as much US dollars as it wants to fund its corruption, it does so, okay? So the US dollar has lessened in value. And what this means is basically it's made inequality worse, it's made corruption worse, it's made people very lazy. If you're a young person, you're like, you know what, no matter how hard I work, I'm still screwed in the end because the boomers, the older generation, have so much more money than I do. I can never catch up. So I refuse to play this game. Either I refuse to play this game, so I quit, dumping, lie flat, or I gamble. I pray that if I put $1 million in Bitcoin, it'll go up to $10 million, or the stock market, or sports betting, okay? That's why in America, gambling has become so popular. All right? So this has led to today, basically. All right? So we shouldn't see this war against Iran as just a decision of one person, Donald Trump, or the machinations of a country, Israel. Really, this war in Iran is happening because we've come to the end of the unipolar moment because the American empire has become corrupt, self-indulgent, lazy, arrogant. All right? So with the end of the American empire, with the end of Pax Americana, we are shifting towards a new world. And this new world, some will survive, most will not. Okay? And this is true throughout history where when the empire declines and the world order is shifting, where there's a paradigm shift, people are forced to make a hard choice of either adapt or die. All right? So let me show you how the world needs to change if it is to survive. Basically, what has to happen is we have to move from an emphasis on efficiency to resilience. Okay? That is the main goal in the future. Today, it's really about how to make things as cheap as possible and get it to as many people as quickly as possible to make as much money as possible, okay? The idea of efficiency. Generating as much profit as possible. The idea of resilience is to appreciate that there will be a series of crises, and what you need to do is focus on adapting and surviving these crises, okay? So for a nation, for a community to survive in the future, there has to be three major changes. And if you're able to make these three major changes, you will survive. If you do not make these changes, you will be eliminated, okay? It will be survival of the fittest. All right, so the first thing you need to do is move from materialism to spirituality. Right now, the entire world, these nation states, have convinced the population what matters is your material well-being. If you are driving a car, if you have a house, if you have enough food to eat, then you should shut up and obey because we're doing a good job. Okay? But in the future, governments can't do that because there are not enough resources to go around. Therefore, the government has to make you believe that what matters is your happiness, your well-being, your spirituality. And that usually means a renewed focus on religion. Okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is to move from a system of individuality to community and family. All right, and what this means is today what you're taught in school, what you're taught in society is what matters is you, me, okay? The ego. If it's doing well for me, it's good. I don't actually care about other people. In the future, you have to focus on building a community, on helping others. Okay? And the last major shift is from the old to the young. Okay? And this is very simple, and this is actually the hardest thing to do, which is like today, most countries, especially the wealthy Western industrial nations, are controlled by the baby boomers, the elderly, the gerontocracy. They have all the money, they have all the power, but for society to thrive in the future, this power needs to shift to a younger generation, ideally maybe in the 30s, okay? The younger the better. And you think this is easy to do, it's not. Because first of all, these baby boomers have access to the best healthcare in the world, they have a lot of money, and they really enjoy living, and they're also really selfish, okay? So this is actually the hardest problem to solve for most Western societies. How do you transfer power from the old to the young? And quite honestly, historically, we've never ever faced this problem before. Never! Because the old simply don't live that long, okay? Now, baby boomers are living to at least 100 years old. So they have another 20 years ahead of them in power. Meanwhile, the young cannot develop the experience and expertise in order to lead the nation. So whichever nation actually figures out this problem first, how do you get rid of the old and give power to the young, then will most likely thrive in the new world that's coming. And if you were to ask me which nation would most likely achieve this first, I would say Japan. And the reason is very simple. Because in Japan, this problem is the most present. They are the eldest population. They have the oldest population in the world. And so they need to resolve this issue really, really quickly. Okay? And maybe in the next 5-10 years, and I think that Japan will actually resolve this issue. But it may be the only nation that's able to resolve this issue because it's so difficult. You love your grandparents. Do you want to see your grandparents die? Of course not. Okay, you're going against human biological nature. All right. So that's the main argument I want to make you today. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at how the world is going to transform because of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, because of this war in Iran. Okay. All right. So basically, we're in a new world because our world today is built entirely on access to cheap petroleum products, cheap energy, right? Why are you allowed to be in school learning from me rather than the fields farming? Because of energy, right? Because of oil from the Middle East. Your computer is based on what? Petroleum. This camera that's filming me is based on what? Petroleum. This pen, petroleum. This clothing, petroleum. The medicine you eat, petroleum. The food that you eat comes from fertilizers, which is based also on petroleum. So basically, everything in this room, everything in the world is based on cheap petroleum. The entire global economy, the main foundation is cheap petroleum. So what happens in a world where petroleum is already cheap? Well, now you need a massive rebalancing in the world, okay? The other thing about the world is, this is the GCC countries, okay? The Middle East countries. And as you can see, this is really important to see is, around the year 2005, they started to have massive account surplus, meaning they were selling so much oil, they couldn't really spend all their money. Do you guys know why? Why was this happening? What happened in 2005, 2004 that made these countries extremely wealthy? All right, China, okay? Think about it. What's China doing? Well, China in the 80s and 90s was putting factories, right? But then China itself developed this account surplus. So now China wants to develop its industrial base, right? And how do you do that? By importing oil from the GCC, right? And that's why we have these skyscrapers, these malls, these roads, okay? Because China was able to import all this cheap oil from the GCC. And then the GCC would take this money, okay? And then invest it back into the American stock market. But not just that, but they would invest it in Africa. They would invest in infrastructure. So for the longest time, the Chinese economy and the GCC are the two main pillars of the entire global economy. Okay? And what this means is that if the GCC no longer is able to export oil, this is going to have a major impact on China. And together, the two are going to have a major impact on the global economy. Okay? Basically, the global economy is dead. All right. Okay, another thing that you may not be aware of is today, flying around the world, it's very, very simple to do. You get up, like you want it. What we can do now is get our mobiles out, go to the website, and look at where we're going to fly to, and then book that flight for tonight. Pay using a credit card, take a taxi to the airport, get on a flight, and we're there the next morning. That's really, really impressive. Guess what, guys? You couldn't do this 20 years ago. Okay? The technology was around, but it was not widely available. Now look at this, where the entire world is interconnected. Okay? This is a pretty stark chart where in 1950, it was considered a tremendous luxury to fly. You had to be a millionaire, basically, to want to fly for vacation. Okay? Everyone else just drove their car. Now, it's like anyone can drive. And again, this happened just in the past, basically, 30, 40 years. And this, of course, is because of Pax Americana, where Pax Americana will guarantee there's no conflict in the world, and therefore, planes can just fly around. Otherwise, you'd be shut down. Okay? All right. Well, this world is coming to an end. In the future, flights will be very expensive, and vacations will be unaffordable. Okay? All right. This is the internet, guys. Yeah, you don't know this. You think that the internet is just that you go on the computer and then boom, the internet is there. No, actually, the internet is undersea cables that connect the entire world. And unfortunately, there's a war going on right here, guys. And unfortunately, it's really easy for Iran to cut off the undersea cables, which would lead to internet disruption for maybe 20-30% of the world. Okay? Northern Africa, India, the Middle East, maybe parts of Europe would lose internet access. You think, okay, well that's fine. They just won't watch Netflix anymore. No, guys, okay? The entire global economy is based off the cloud. So if you want to bank, if you want basically finance, okay? So this is going to have a huge impact in the world. And this can happen anytime, where for whatever reason, there's a war going on in the Strait of Hormuz, some cables get cut off, and then suddenly you've lost internet access. And this would basically cause major disruptions throughout the world. All right.
The dollar stuff is interesting and mostly right. The idea that the dollar functions almost like a shared fiction, a collective belief system that only works because everyone agrees it works. That's basically just describing fiat currency, but the speaker frames it in a way that highlights how fragile that consensus really is. And the point about how dollar dominance enables America to essentially export its fiscal irresponsibility is well taken. When you can print the world's reserve currency, the normal consequences of bad monetary policy get delayed and distributed globally. Other countries essentially subsidize American spending by holding dollars and buying US debt. That's a real dynamic, and it does create the kind of moral hazard the speaker is describing, where the US can fund wars, bail out banks, run massive deficits, and never really face the music because everyone else is locked into the dollar system. The BRICS nations trying to develop alternative payment systems isn't happening in a vacuum. It's a direct response to this. But here's where the speaker starts losing me a bit. The claim about scientific innovation being dead or stagnant for 20 to 30 years is just flatly wrong. And it's the kind of claim that reveals a certain superficiality in the analysis. Yes, you can make a case that a lot of what Silicon Valley produces is incremental rather than revolutionary. Yes, there's a real argument that we've been in a period of technological stagnation compared to, say, the 1870 to 1970 period that gave us electricity, antibiotics, aviation, nuclear energy, the green revolution in agriculture, and so on. Peter Thiel has been making this argument for years, and there's something to it. But to just wave your hand and say all they do is make food delivery apps is intellectually dishonest. Vaccine technology was arguably the most important biomedical breakthrough in a generation, and it happened right in the middle of the period the speaker dismisses. CRISPR gene editing is potentially civilization altering. The AI developments of the last few years alone, whether you think they're net positive or terrifying, represent a genuine paradigm shift in computing. Renewable energy technology has gotten so cheap so fast that it's fundamentally reshaping energy markets. SpaceX has made reusable rockets work, which people said was impossible. So the speaker's framing here feels like it's in service of a narrative rather than an honest assessment of reality. And that makes me trust the rest of the analysis a little less. Because if someone is willing to oversimplify here, where else are they cutting corners? The corruption and inequality argument is stronger. The idea that cheap money, enabled by dollar dominance and quantitative easing, has inflated asset prices, widened the wealth gap, and created a generation of young people who feel like the game is rigged against them. So they either check out or gamble on crypto and meme stocks. Yeah, that tracks pretty well with what we've actually seen. The quiet quitting phenomenon, the explosion of sports betting, the cryptomania, the general sense of nihilism among millennials and Gen Z about traditional career paths, these are all real things, and connecting them back to monetary policy and structural inequality is a reasonable move. I think the speaker actually undersells how deep this goes. It's not just about money, it's about the erosion of the social contract more broadly. The sense that institutions don't work for ordinary people anymore, that expertise has been captured by special interests, that the meritocratic promise was always somewhat illusory. Now, the resilience versus efficiency framework, this is honestly the best part of the whole talk. And I wish the speaker had spent more time here instead of on some of the more sensationalist stuff. The idea that the entire global economy has been optimized for efficiency at the expense of resilience is profound and important. Just in time manufacturing, global supply chains, extreme specialization, monoculture agriculture, all of these things are incredibly efficient under normal conditions and incredibly fragile under stress. The pandemic showed us this in real time. A ship got stuck in the Suez Canal for like 6 days, and it disrupted global trade for months. That's how tight the margins are. A single point of failure can cascade through the whole system. So, the call to think about resilience, about building systems that can absorb shocks, rather than systems that maximize output under perfect conditions, is genuinely wise. This is something that individuals, communities, and nations all need to be thinking about. But then we get into the three big shifts the speaker prescribes. And this is where things get really messy for me. Materialism to spirituality. On one level, I get what the speaker is gesturing at. There's decent research showing that beyond a certain income threshold, additional wealth doesn't meaningfully increase happiness. There's also a real argument that consumer culture has left people feeling empty and disconnected, and that some reorientation toward meaning, purpose, and community would be healthier. Fine, but the speaker essentially equates spirituality with religion and then just kind of moves on like that's an unproblematic prescription. It isn't. Which religion? Whose version of it? History is absolutely littered with examples of quote unquote spiritual rejuvenation movements that turned into theocratic authoritarianism, sectarian violence, or both. The Iranian Revolution was a spiritual rejuvenation movement. ISIS presented itself as a spiritual rejuvenation movement. I'm not saying religion is inherently bad. Obviously, it provides genuine meaning and community for billions of people. But to casually prescribe it as the answer to civilizational decline without engaging with any of the enormous complications is just irresponsible. And there's something a bit paternalistic about it, too. This idea that the masses need religion to keep them docile when material conditions deteriorate. That's not spirituality. That's social control dressed up as wisdom, individualism to community. Again, on the surface, hard to argue with. Hyper individualism has clearly corroded social bonds in a lot of Western societies. People are lonelier than ever. Civic participation is declining. Trust in institutions and in each other is at historic lows. A shift toward community mindedness and mutual aid would probably be a good thing. But the speaker presents this so simply, as if it's just a matter of deciding to care about other people. The forces driving atomization, economic precarity, geographic mobility, digital technology replacing face to face interaction, the commodification of housing and public spaces, these are structural, not just attitudinal. You can't just tell people to be more communal when the entire economic system incentivizes the opposite. And frankly, some of the most quote unquote communal societies in history were also deeply oppressive in terms of individual rights, particularly for women, minorities, and dissenters. The tension between individual freedom and collective solidarity is one of the oldest and most difficult problems in political philosophy, and the speaker just breezes past it. The generational power transfer. This one is genuinely interesting, and the speaker raises a real problem. The gerontocracy in Western democracies is real. The average age of political leadership has been creeping up for decades. Wealth concentration among older generations is extreme, and the healthcare point is legitimate. People are living much longer than they used to, which means they're holding on to power much longer. But the speaker's prediction that Japan will solve this first because their demographic crisis is most acute, I just don't follow the logic. Having the worst version of a problem doesn't mean you'll find the solution first. It might just mean you collapse first. Japan has been dealing with demographic decline for 30 years, and their response so far has mostly been stagnation, not breakthrough innovation in governance or social organization. Their politics are still dominated by elderly men. Their corporate culture still rewards seniority over merit. If anything, Japan is a cautionary tale about how hard this problem is, not an inspiring example of how it gets solved. The petroleum dependency section is mostly straightforward and accurate, though the speaker oversimplifies quite a bit. Yes, modern civilization runs on fossil fuels to an extraordinary degree. Yes, disruption to oil markets would have cascading effects on everything from food production to manufacturing to transportation. But there's this weird absence of any discussion of the energy transition that's already underway. Solar and wind are now cheaper than fossil fuels in most markets. Electric vehicle adoption is accelerating. Battery storage technology is improving rapidly. None of this means we can transition overnight or that it'll be painless, But the speaker presents the petroleum dependency as if it's a permanent, unchangeable fact rather than a problem that's actively being worked on. It's like describing someone's disease without mentioning that they're already on medication. The prognosis might still be bad, but ignoring the treatment entirely gives a distorted picture. The food security and water scarcity discussion is important, and the maps are probably effective visually, though I obviously can't see them from the transcript. The basic point, that global food production depends on a complex web of trade in fertilizers, energy, and agricultural products, and that disruption to this web would cause mass famine in vulnerable regions, is correct. And then there's the slavery thing. I need to talk about this because the speaker brought it up with alarming casualness. The basic argument seems to be historically, when societies couldn't access cheap energy, they used human labor, slavery, to fill the gap. And this could happen again. Maybe the speaker intended this as a warning rather than a prediction, but the way it's presented, almost as a footnote, with no moral horror, no extended discussion of how to prevent it, is deeply unsettling. Slavery isn't some natural law that kicks in when oil gets expensive. It's a political and moral choice that societies make, and treating it as an inevitable consequence of energy scarcity normalizes something that should be treated as an absolute ethical red line. This is actually one of my biggest problems with the whole talk. There's this undercurrent of historical determinism that strips away moral agency. Things just happen because of structural forces, and individuals and societies are just along for the ride. That's a profoundly disempowering worldview, and it's also wrong. History is shaped by choices, movements, leaders, and ideas, not just material conditions. The migration section is fine as far as it goes. Climate change, food insecurity, water scarcity, and conflict will absolutely drive massive population movements in the coming decades. This is already happening, and the tension between aging wealthy nations that need immigrant labor and nativist populations that resist demographic change is a real and growing political flashpoint. But the framing is a bit deterministic again, as if this inevitably leads to cultural conflict and civil strife. Some societies have managed immigration and demographic change better than others. Canada, for all its problems, has generally done a better job of integrating immigrants than, say, France. Singapore has built a multi ethnic society that mostly functions. The outcome isn't predetermined. The regional trading blocks prediction is probably the most consensus ready take in the whole talk. The trend toward deglobalization, reshoring, friendshoring, and regional economic integration is already visible and accelerating. The comparison to mercantile empires of the 16th and 17th centuries is a bit of a stretch. The technological and institutional context is so different that historical analogies only take you so far, but the general direction seems right. A world of competing economic blocs centered around the US, China, and possibly the EU, with smaller nations forced to choose sides, is a scenario that a lot of serious analysts are already gaming out. The overall rhetorical style of this talk bothers me, and I think it's worth naming why. There's this very specific genre of geopolitical punditry that works by taking real problems, connecting them into a grand narrative, cranking the stakes up to existential, and then delivering the whole thing with this wake up sheeple energy. It's compelling to listen to because it makes you feel like you're getting access to hidden truths that the mainstream won't tell you. But it's also intellectually dishonest in subtle ways. It cherry picks evidence, ignores counterexamples, presents predictions as certainties, and uses emotional pressure, adapt or die, to short circuit critical thinking. Real analysis lives in the uncertainty, in the range of possible outcomes, in the acknowledgement that complex systems are inherently unpredictable. This speaker doesn't really do any of that. Everything fits neatly into the narrative. Every trend points in the same direction. And the only question is whether you're brave enough to face the truth. Which isn't to say you should dismiss everything here. A lot of the underlying concerns about American decline, about the fragility of global systems, about demographic imbalance, about resource scarcity are legitimate and important. But the packaging matters. When serious problems get wrapped in this kind of apocalyptic, all or nothing framing, it can actually make people less capable of responding effectively because it creates a sense of helplessness and fatalism rather than clarity about what can actually be done. The world has faced existential seeming crises before: the world wars, the Cold War nuclear standoff, the 2008 financial crisis, the pandemic. And while none of these were handled perfectly, we muddled through because people and institutions adapted in ways that weren't predictable in advance. That's the thing about complex systems. They surprise you in both directions. And any analysis that doesn't leave room for that surprise isn't really analysis, it's storytelling. Opus 4.6 Extended.